Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our panel discussion today on prospects and challenges for Taiwan in the years ahead. I'm Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy here at the Brookings Institution, and I'm delighted to introduce today's panel discussion. This conversation comes at a critical time. Cross-strait tensions have been rising in recent years. The 20th Party Congress will occur this fall in China, and elections in the United States and Taiwan will take place in 2024. Of course, this conversation also comes against the backdrop of the tragedy occurring in Ukraine. Russia's invasion has provided a sobering reminder of the real risks of conflict and the consequences that accompany it. The war in Ukraine has prompted questions around the world about the possible implications for Taiwan's security. World leaders have increasingly spoken out publicly about Taiwan's security being a matter of both regional and global concern. Given the stakes involved, it is all the more important for our public discussions on Taiwan to be informed by experts who have deep knowledge of the factors that could influence Taiwan's future. There are few in the world who could speak with greater authority on these questions than the panelists we've assembled here today. In the coming 40 minutes, they will examine the future direction of U.S.-Taiwan relations, cross-strait relations, and developments within Taiwan. I'll introduce them now in alphabetical order. Richard Bush was the inaugural GU Chair in Taiwan Studies at the Brookings Institution, where he also served as the director of the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He's currently a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. Prior to joining Brookings in 2002, Richard had a very distinguished career in government, serving in the intelligence community on Capitol Hill, and as chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan. He's the author of many books, most recently, Difficult Choices, Taiwan's Quest for Security and the Good Life. Shelley Rigger is the Brown Professor of East Asian Politics and the Assistant Dean for Education Policy at Davidson College in North Carolina. She began her academic career conducting research on Chinese politics and later shifted to studying democratization in Taiwan. She is widely recognized as one of America's leading experts on Taiwan, having published numerous books, monographs, and articles on developments related to Taiwan. Her most recent book is The Tiger Leading the Dragon: How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise. Kharis Templeman is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is a political scientist who focuses on Taiwan politics, democratization, elections, party system development, and politics and security issues in East Asia. In 2020, he co-edited the book Dynamics of Democracy in Taiwan, The Ma Ying-jeou Years. He is a rising star in the field of Taiwan studies. This panel will be moderated by the Brookings Institution's GU Chair in Taiwan Studies, Ryan Haas. Prior to his service at Brookings, Ryan served as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the National Security Council staff during the Obama administration. In that role, he advised President Obama and senior White House officials on all aspects of U.S. policy toward China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and he coordinated the implementation of U.S. policy toward this region among U.S. government departments and agencies. Before handing the mic over to Ryan and getting to this panel discussion among such tremendous experts, let me just remind you again that this event is on the record and streaming live. Ryan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. We really appreciate your kind introduction of today's event. As Suzanne mentioned, we're going to break our conversation into three parts. We'll start looking at the domestic political situation inside Taiwan, then we will broaden out to look at cross-strait relations, and then to U.S.-Taiwan relations. But before we dive into those big, meaty topics, I want to ask about something that's on the news. And that is President Biden's comments in Tokyo this week, where he indicated that the United States has a commitment to come to Taiwan's defense, and that there is also no change in longstanding policy. How do you interpret these statements? Are they a major policy shift? Were they significant? Shelley, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I don't think that this is really a shift in U.S. policy. I think, there are various ways that one can express the fundamental kind of spirit of U.S. policy. And some of those are more formal and detailed and specific and aligned with the sort of what's on the book. and some of them are more really just speaking to the spirit of the matter. And I would put President Biden's remarks in more on the spiritual side. How's that?
Richard?
Yes. I think two things are going on here, and this is just a guess on my part. I have no way of knowing. But I think, first of all, President Biden may have forgotten about the blank check problem that an absolute defense commitment to a place like Taiwan creates. It releases the leaders of a place like Taiwan from behaving responsibly. And we've had experience with this. I was in government at the time that Lee Teng-hui and then Chen Shui-bian were president, and this was a problem that we wrestled with, that there was great confidence in Taiwan about our willingness to come to its defense, and that led to certain actions that made the situation more complicated. The other thing that I think is going on goes back to the history of the passage of the Taiwan Relations Act. And briefly put, the managers of that bill had to make it seem more robust and meaningful than it really was. They favored normalization. They wanted President Carter to be able to sign the bill, but the Carter administration wanted to preserve presidential power, including over things like arms sales and defense commitments. So most members of Congress at that time were led to believe that the language of Section 3 was actually stronger than it was. And I think that that's where President Biden's mind is even today.
Kharis?
It's not his fault. He was the victim of a con.
Wow. Okay, well, I'm glad I'm going third on this. I guess my reaction to that question was there's an important distinction that often gets elided between our one China policy and strategic ambiguity, and they're not the same thing. The one China policy is about whether the United States recognizes the government in Taipei or Beijing or both. And starting from 1979, we recognize the government in Beijing, full stop. The other part of our one China policy is about Taiwan's status and whether we recognize that it's part of China or whether we do not recognize, and we do not. We acknowledge, but we do not actually take a position on Taiwan's status. And so that part of our policy, all of the kind of diplomatic fine-tuning that came along with normalization of relations remains intact. The strategic ambiguity part of this is a different question. It's about whether the United States is committed to coming to Taiwan's defense or under what conditions we might intervene in a conflict. And there, ultimately, given what Richard's just said, it should be obvious that it ultimately rests on the president's own willingness to put American lives in harm's way to defend the people of Taiwan. When there's some question about that, then I think that increases the uncertainty in the cross-strait relationship. And so I think Biden weighing in here is not a violation of our one China policy. It's not. I'd also note that he's not the first president to actually explicitly say, yes, I would intervene if there were a conflict. George W. Bush said the same thing in 2001. So I'm not going to take a position on whether it was the right thing for him to do or not, but he clearly thought it was important to signal both to the Taiwanese and to Beijing that intervention in the strait was something he was willing to do.
Great. Well, if we can, why don't we transition now to domestic politics inside Taiwan? And I'd like to start with you, Kharis, because a lot of people, there's a narrative that the KMT is going to have a hard time in 2024 reclaiming the presidency. But 2024 is a long time from now.
Yeah.
So what do you see as some of the signposts that will give us a directional indicator of whether the KMT will be competitive coming into 2024, and how do you rate their odds?
Yeah, so I'd start with what we know from the last election in 2020, which was Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, won a landslide victory with over 57% of the vote, really just crushed the KMT candidate. But at the same time, if you drill down a little bit and look at the party vote in the party list vote that voters cast, the KMT and the DPP were actually neck and neck. And there's a third of the voters who cast votes for other parties. And so it's not a given that the DPP has this structural advantage over the KMT based on the party list votes from 2020. Now, there's been a lot of kind of ups and downs in polling since then that suggests the DPP is polling significantly higher than the KMT, and that the KMT may be struggling even to keep up with this kind of upstart Taiwan People's Party. But I would go back to 2020 as kind of the turnout was high there. The KMT was able to mobilize a large share of the electorate behind its candidate, and we shouldn't discount the possibility they can do that the next time around. The other things I'd look at, the 2022 election, it's easy to forget now with this kind of narrative of KMT defeat, but they actually won big in 2018. They control a majority of the localities in Taiwan, and they actually have some pretty promising opportunities to pick up a couple seats. So I would look at the results of those elections as kind of an indicator of whether the party can get its act together, nominate the right candidates, run really competitive campaigns in places where they have a kind of generic, at least even. It should be toss-up at least. They should be able to make some inroads in those places.
Interesting. So, Shelley, what do Taiwan voters care about most? What most moves the dial, and where are the fault lines? Is it partisan? Is it generational?
So it depends upon whether we're talking about the elections this year, which are local elections, in which case the personalities of the candidates, their sort of mobilizational capacity in their districts, local issues like energy, pollution, housing, all the usual stuff. Those are the issues, and I think that's part of why I agree with Kharis that they could do well in the local elections. Or whether you're talking about national elections, which are the elections that are coming up in 2024, where there's a presidential election and legislative elections. And there's a lot more focus on which of the candidates, and to some extent party matters less because of what the party's leadership or even the candidates themselves will say their policy is, than on how people over the long run, how voters understand the basic nature and core preferences of the parties. So what is the issue that they have this core preference and nature on is how capable they are of managing the relationship with mainland China in a way that secures the preference of the really strong majority of Taiwanese who do not prefer independence or unification, who are convinced that the sort of the safest and most viable way for Taiwan to go forward is finding a way to navigate between those two extremes and to preserve the status quo. So both parties want to claim that turf. They have slightly different ideas about how best to do that. So for the Democratic Progressive Party, the current incumbent party in the presidency and also the legislative majority, the position is, look, Taiwan is already an independent state under the doing business as the Republic of China, Taiwan, and that's what we want to continue to do. But within that framework, the DPP tends to prioritize making sure that Taiwan is safe and is kind of as self-contained, as little exposed as it can be to mainland China. We know that Taiwan is very exposed to the PRC economically, right? 40% of its exports go to the mainland. So to the extent to which, it's possible to reduce the vulnerabilities that come from that, that's kind of the orientation that the DPP takes. And certainly that's how voters understand the DPP's kind of core position. The KMT, on the other hand, has historically held the view that more engagement with the mainland doesn't make Taiwan more vulnerable. It actually kind of ties down the PRC leadership and decreases the likelihood that the PRC leadership might lean in or try to undermine Taiwan in some way. So those are the sort of two big options. How the candidates present those options, and then on top of that, how credible voters believe the candidates are in actually delivering that sort of broad package will determine to a significant extent, I think, how the national elections go. Although with the legislative elections, as everywhere else, there's also all kinds of local stuff that goes into it.
Right. Thank you. Richard, you wrote eloquently in your most recent book that Taiwan's leaders have to make hard choices to preserve the good life in Taiwan. What are some of the hard choices you would like to see or that you expect to see the Tsai administration make in the remaining time in power?
Okay, it's a good question. It's a tough question. I have three wonky answers to that, and then a broader political answer. The first wonky suggestion is that President Tsai do her best to accelerate the reform of the fiscal system, both regarding revenues and expenditures. Taiwan's government needs more resources to deal with all the tasks it has to face, both domestically and externally. So tax rates need to be changed, and the burden of taxation shifted more to those who have a lot of wealth. There is money there, the government just isn't getting enough of it. Second, President Tsai could help her successor by securing passage of a long-promised bill on the supervision of cross-strait economic agreements. This goes back to 2014. As long as a bill is not passed, the politics of the place make it impossible for Taiwan to negotiate an agreement, even if the political preconditions are right and even if it's in Taiwan's interest. Doing this will probably require the KMT and the DPP to work together in a constructive and responsible way. But I think that President Tsai's successor, whoever it is, would thank her for doing that. Third, I think that it would be useful for the Tsai administration to assess the effectiveness of Taiwan's resistance to China's campaign of coercion over the last 5+ years. What has worked? What's not? Where are improvements needed? The time invested in doing that assessment may pay dividends later on. Finally, more on the political side, I think that she should continue to make her case that Taiwan will be better able to meet the challenges before it if Taiwan elites come together and reach broader agreements on the challenges that Taiwan faces and how to meet them. This is easy for me to say. It's hard for Taiwan leaders to do, but I think it's necessary under the circumstances.
Thank you. I'd like to transition us now to cross-strait relations. And Shelley, you've done a fair bit of polling, you and your colleagues in Taiwan, about Taiwan public preferences for cross-strait relations. What has that polling taught us?
Well, the most important thing I think that we can take away from many, many years of polling on cross-strait relations is that the binary choice that is often kind of assumed to exist between independence and unification is just not really the right way to think about it, right? A plurality of Taiwanese. So one of the ways that we ask this question, so there's a million ways to ask the question, are you for Taiwan, are you for independence or unification? So many ways to ask this question. But one of the ways we ask this question on a survey that I did with a group of people just about a year ago was on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being I want independence right now, and 10 being I want unification right now. If you looked at that graph, what you would see is one bar right in the middle at 5, right? Overwhelmingly, the plurality chose I refuse to answer this question. So, there's a few people at the ends. There's a little bit of evidence of polarization. There's like a handful of people who want unification now, a much larger couple handfuls who want independence now, and then there's like little teeny things across but the real weight is at the center. And I think that that's what we have to kind of come to terms with, is that the desire certainly in Beijing, among some in Taiwan, and certainly among many in the international community, to get some closure on this daggone Taiwan thing by like getting to an outcome is just, Taiwan is not going to give that to us, right? What the preference is, but what does that mean? What does neither independence nor unification really mean? What it means is we don't want to be part of the PRC, but we don't want to take new action to make permanent or to in some way enshrine in a new form Taiwan's separate and autonomous status, if that is going to lead to, a military confrontation with the PRC. So the uncertainty or the imperfection, so when President Tsai Ing-wen came up with this kind of portmanteau term, Republic of China Taiwan, which in English often comes with parentheses, but in Chinese does not. When she came up with that term, it was very meaningful, because a lot of people in Taiwan, they don't love the Republic of China part. But and some people in Taiwan don't like the Taiwan part. But what this term does is it says, look, this is who we are. We are the Republic of China because that's what allows us to have all these other things that we want. And we are Taiwan because Taiwan is sufficient in itself. And so, that's where I think, to me, that is the single most important thing that we can take away from public opinion polling.
Fascinating. Richard, take us to the other side of the Taiwan Strait. From Beijing's perspective, how does the situation look right now, and what signposts or factors do you think they'll be paying most attention to between now and 2024?
Okay. First, it appears that Beijing believes that it has deterred the Tsai administration from moving towards independence. Its propaganda says that, President Tsai is acting every day to move in an independence direction, but it's not happening. So Beijing has blocked what it fears. Second, there is some reason to believe that its current approach, which I call coercion without violence, is working. The target of this approach is the confidence of the Taiwan people in their ability to preserve the current status quo in the face of Chinese pressure. Now, Shelley is right that if you ask people in Taiwan, what's the outcome you want, the share who say unification is very low. If you ask them, what outcome do you expect, the share who believe that unification is going to happen goes up to probably 50%. That's a big difference. Now, coercion without violence will take time. It may actually not work, but the risks of doing that are much less than a military campaign. China believes that it has the initiative and that time is on its side. Beijing's main source of dissatisfaction right now is that the US government is being very open in its support of Taiwan in ways that bolster Taiwan's confidence and undercut Beijing's strategy to dilute Taiwan confidence. China's medium-term concern is who wins in the 2024 election, both presidential and legislative. Let's not forget the legislative yuan. It would no doubt prefer that the KMT return to power in both branches. It probably worries that the election will demonstrate that the DPP has broad support and that a new DPP leadership might take risks that President Tsai has not taken. So.
Thank you. Kharis, in the last presidential election in Taiwan, Hong Kong was a backdrop, and it provided a real tailwind, it seemed, for the incumbent president to be reelected. And what role do you expect cross-strait relations will play in 2024?
Yeah, I think it's a huge question, and a lot has to do with what strategy Beijing chooses to pursue. Generally, when Beijing tries to meddle in Taiwanese elections, it backfires on them. I think that's exactly what happened in 2020. They tried to increase the sense of threat and coercion and the use of united front tactics to try to affect the Taiwan media and civil society. And a lot of that was exposed, or at least there was enough credible evidence that Beijing was trying to do that a lot of Taiwanese felt like sovereignty and security were the critical issues, and we needed to vote for Tsai Ing-wen to stick it to Beijing. So the question is whether Beijing will pursue a similar tactic in 2024 that they did and failed with in 2020. I think the smart strategy for them would be to kind of enter a quiet period, not say anything about Taiwan. And generally the KMT does best when Beijing is of lower salience, when the cross-strait issue is of less direct concern. And so I don't want to venture a guess about what Beijing will try to do, but I would note that from my perspective, Beijing's Taiwan policy has been more or less on autopilot over the last 6 years. They set in place a plan to coerce Tsai Ing-wen to try to compel her to accept a version of the One China principle, at least endorse the 1992 consensus in the same way that the KMT did. And when she didn't do that, they rolled out this very comprehensive strategy to, on the one hand, impose some hard pressure on the Tsai administration, on the other to roll out additional soft benefits to try to attract Taiwanese who are not directly linked to pro-independence figures, to try to divide the pro-independence or green camp. So I kind of suspect, given the lack of any adjustment or movement after the 2020 election, when that strategy clearly backfired, that this is likely to continue. Ultimately, Xi Jinping is not doing the KMT any favors if this strategy continues, but if I gun to my head, I would say he probably will.
Interesting. Moving to U.S.-Taiwan relations. Richard, I'd love to start with you.
Okay.
There's a view in Washington that is popular in some quarters that the intensifying friction in the Taiwan Strait is really basically a function of Beijing and Taipei, that there's an interactive dynamic and that the United States is sort of outside of that dynamic, observing the interplay between both sides. Does that sound right to you? Where do you fit in on the spectrum of this debate? I'm
on the other side of that issue. I mean, I will not deny that the interaction between Beijing and Taipei does have a significant impact on outcomes. And it is in the U.S. interest for leaders on both sides of the strait to work together and be responsible for their own mutual security. That said, there's no question that the United States looms large in this equation. Taiwan would not be the society it is today absent the American role over the last 7+ decades. Beijing, on the other hand, has always preferred that we essentially butt out. For example, at the time of normalization, Deng Xiaoping was very unhappy when it became perfectly clear that the United States was going to continue to sell arms to Taiwan. And his logic at the time was interesting, and that was, Deng believed that President Jiang Jingguo would not negotiate on unification if U.S. military backing continued. For Deng, a confident Taiwan would not submit. So fast forward to today, I said before that Beijing's strategy is coercion without violence, and the target of that campaign is the confidence of the Taiwan people. And what do we see the United States doing? I think that what the United States is doing is, by a variety of actions and in response to Beijing's effort to undermine Taiwan confidence, we're doing things to boost Taiwan confidence. So previously, we sent destroyers through the Taiwan Strait and we didn't say anything about it. We kept quiet. Now we broadcast it because we want the people of Taiwan to hear, so that they are less anxious about the future. And I suspect that we'll continue to do that.
Kharis, if I could ask you to pick up where Richard left off and sort of help walk us through what do you think about as some of the biggest risks and the biggest opportunities going forward for U.S.-Taiwan relations?
Yeah. So one of the things I worry about a lot these days is the ways in which deterrence, that concept, is thrown around in the kind of U.S. conversation about Taiwan. And I'm not an IR expert, but I have gone back and read Schelling, and more recently Tom Christensen has written about this issue in a very eloquent way, which is that deterrence has two parts. One is you threaten your target with punishment if they do something you don't like, right? And we're very focused on the ability to threaten, right? So both to make that threat credible, so our will, we want to demonstrate that we do have the will to follow through, and our capability, we want to actually have the ability to do it. But there's another part to deterrence, which is a promise that if you don't do what we don't want you to do, we won't still go ahead and beat you, right? We won't follow through with the threat. We won't punish you. And that requires reassurance. So I worry a little bit that by focusing so much on will and capability, we're ignoring or at least playing down the kind of reassurance that the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence, that we are not looking for a future for Taiwan that is permanently detached from the PRC. Those are the things that Beijing needs to hear to be reassured that the rise of our capability and will is not going to result in Taiwan independence. And so I think that dynamic right now is, and that's happening here in DC as much as it is in Beijing or Taipei. And so I worry a little bit about that conversation. In terms of opportunities, I've been struck by just the rise in the kind of awareness and importance given to Taiwan's semiconductor industry, and the kind of awakening in the U.S. that, wow, Taiwan is actually an important economic partner of the United States, and if we were to lose access to Taiwan's exports, we're going to be up a creek without a paddle on certain issues. And so there are some real opportunities for Taiwan, I think, to take advantage of that much greater and more urgent concern in the U.S. about securing our supply chains for national security reasons, and trying to build a broader set of economic and political relationships with the United States. It's a very different kind of conversation than, say, 12 or 15 years ago, where Taiwan was, 小事. It's a little thing, and we want to try to minimize it so that the U.S.-China relationship can continue to develop and deepen. And now Taiwan has much greater opportunities, actually. The doors are open in a way that they weren't 10 or 15 years ago.
Interesting. Well, Shelley, I would love for you to offer any reflections you have on Richard and Kharis's comments, but I also want to add one more question for you, which is that there's a lot of energy right now in Washington to support Taiwan. A lot of enthusiasm for Taiwan, especially on Capitol Hill, but really throughout the U.S. government. Some of that is being spurred by events in Ukraine and a certain concern that we don't want what happens in Ukraine to be repeated in Taiwan. How should that energy, enthusiasm, support, sympathy for Taiwan be most productively channeled and applied to strengthen the U.S.-Taiwan relationship and U.S. interest in the Taiwan Strait?
Let me back out of that question a little bit and link to the comments that have already been made by saying something about what we can learn about the PRC's thinking regarding Taiwan from the PRC's thinking about Ukraine, right? So the PRC is trying to maintain this posture of neutrality with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it doesn't feel very neutral to us, because what we hear the PRC defending the invasion of Ukraine. Maybe it was not great to, violate sovereignty, but from Beijing's perspective, of course, Russia was going to invade Ukraine because the U.S. backed Russia into a corner and left it no choice. What I think they're telling us when they say that is, you are backing us into a corner and you are going to leave us no choice. So when the U.S. claims that, why do we care about Taiwan? Why do we want to do things that will enable Taiwan to continue to pursue its own objectives? We say because it's a democracy, because it's we have all of our arguments. But what the PRC hears is that is just a lot of claptrap. What you really want is you want to prevent the restoration of the Chinese nation to its rightful status in the world. You want to prevent us from rising. You want to continue to divide our motherland, and you did this to Russia by denying Russia's legitimate security needs in its near abroad, in the post-Soviet and post-Warsaw Pact parts of Europe. That's what you're up to in Taiwan. So we have to find ways to address and to grapple with that reality, because we may think that sounds like nonsense, and we may think that's just a kind of cover over Beijing's real objectives. But I think we have to consider the possibility that they cannot imagine that the U.S. is actually motivated by a genuine concern for people who don't live in the United States of America. In the same way that the PRC does not believe our claims about human rights, right? It doesn't believe our claims about the value that we place on the autonomy and democracy in Taiwan. So, I don't know what the answer is, but I think perpetually brushing off that rationale doesn't help us to design approaches that are reassuring to Beijing at the same time that they are sufficiently threatening that that they give Beijing reasons to think twice. So my position on what the U.S. should do is always, and I'm not in Congress, so I don't have to actually know the answer, but the sort of broad category of things that I think it makes sense for the U.S. to try to do for Taiwan are things of real substance. So, if there is a weapons platform that would make a big difference in Taiwan's defense, then it might be worth irritating Beijing to supply that. We know that Taiwan's economy is incredibly important to the U.S. We should be out there promoting trade relations with Taiwan, not kind of perpetually inventing reasons why we can't incorporate Taiwan into our trade frameworks, for example. Taiwan makes this big sacrifice to accept U.S. meat exports on the expectation that the U.S. is going to respond with some kind of trade agreement. And where is the trade agreement, right? So, these kinds of substantive things, I think, are maybe worth challenging Beijing's preferences on. Where I think we too often default is to statements, symbolic actions, invite somebody, invite the Taiwanese president to address a joint session of Congress, make a trip on a military aircraft to Taiwan. It gets a lot of attention. It certainly raises Beijing's hackles, but was Taiwan substantively aided by that action? If not, then maybe do less of that and more of something to which the answer would be yes.
Mm-hmm. Kharis, Richard, do you have any reactions to that?
I have so many reactions, but there's so little time. So I think we should go to questions.
The floor is open if anyone would like to pose a question. And while our audience in the room composes their thoughts, I did want to take advantage of a question that we received from a student of yours, I believe, Jordan Mills.
Oh, yes.
I appreciate the moxie of Jordan Mills to ask the professor a question on stage. If the United States were to offer a formal guarantee of military defense of Taiwan, what effects would this have Would it discourage Taiwan from further developing its own military?
Hello, Jordan. I say yes. Actually, and his name is Mills Jordan.
Oh,
so it's
I'm
actually
sorry.
Mills. I know, it confused me all semester. Mills, I say yes, but I want to know what these guys think.
I think there's a decent chance that the PRC would focus on the word formal and say this is a restoration of the situation before January 1st, 1979. It's like the treaty. And ending the treaty was a condition for normalization. That condition is no longer being met. U.S.-China relations are going into a bottomless pit.
Yeah, I'll say something that I wanted to say earlier that kind of piggybacks on this, and that is the question of whether Taiwan is an existential issue for the Chinese Communist Party. Taiwan's current situation is not an existential issue, and we know that just literally because they've existed for 70 years without exercising political control over Taiwan. They've prospered for the last 40, and as Shelley's book demonstrates, perhaps they prospered because they didn't exercise political control over Taiwan. What I worry about is that things that the United States or Taiwan does to indicate that Taiwan will be permanently detached from the mainland will turn that into an existential issue. And so I'm a bit skeptical of claims that Xi Jinping has set a final deadline, that Taiwan's continued de facto independence is intolerable for the CCP, that this is the last piece of restoring the Zuguo, the motherland, and achieving national rejuvenation. There's a lot of that language in Xi Jinping's speeches, but there's not a clear deadline for it. And I think we need to find ways to continue to manage this issue over the next years and decades, and I think it will be decades, without provoking a military confrontation.
And the point that no one in China is willing to acknowledge, but is the fundamental reality, is that China's formula for unification has absolutely no market on Taiwan. And Beijing has, through Hong Kong, for example, has guaranteed that it has no market. So why is Taiwan and why are the United States being blamed for the PRC not being able to achieve its goal? There's a mirror that they should be looking into.
We have one final question, and it'll be a speed round because we're almost out of time. It's from Thomas Lupica, who's a college student. How concerned are you about the possibility of war in the coming years?
I am not very concerned about the near term because China has been historically a cautious actor when a lot is at stake and a lot is unknown. And I think those two conditions apply in this situation.
I think the chances are low for the foreseeable future. A, because it is clear that the preferences of the Taiwan public in that democratic system are for the status quo and against both unification and independence. Moreover, I think that China's current strategy is smart. I can't say whether it's going to succeed, but it's low risk. So they can be doing a lot and appear to be doing a lot, but they never cross our red lines.
This is the strategy of coercion without violence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with my two co-panelists. I'm trying to think what else I can add to that other than if we think in terms of timelines, Xi Jinping repeatedly says time and history are on China's side, right? And that suggests there's reason for strategic patience. If they really do believe China's rise is inexorable, the U.S. is in relative, if not absolute, decline. Our politics are very dysfunctional from their perspective, from some of ours as well. Why not wait another 10 or 15 years when you have a much better hand to play if you believe that the trends are like this? And so from that perspective, I think that in the near run, the likelihood of a unilateral move on Taiwan that starts in Beijing is quite low.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for injecting a thoughtful, nuanced, balanced perspective on the situation in Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait into our discourse at a time when there are a lot of very over-caffeinated takes by pundits who have parachuted into an issue from elsewhere. So thank you very much for your time, for your thoughts. Kharis, we need to get you to the airport so you can get back to your day job.
Thank you.